Hey everyone, welcome to the show. I'm your host Pete Bickford. This is the ComicBase Livestream. We're getting started just a touch slow today, but hopefully we'll pick up the speed and we'll get back on the thing. All right, I think I'm good to go on this score. All right, let me go ahead and kick things off here. Full screen on me, hopefully, if I can get the key turned off. Come on, baby, you can do it. There we go. All right. Sorry about that, guys. This is strange enough. This is one of those ones that is requiring just a stupid amount of prep work to get the show ready to go. So, hope it pays off. But anyway, welcome everyone, and let me go ahead and pull up the chat so I can see who's here. Wow, a lot of folks here. Oh, Oro, hey, welcome first up here, and Robbie, good to see everyone. Brian, Greg, our mod, thank you very much for all that. He's one of the guys who keeps this whole thing running at least as well as it does. Or or not going to talking about quantum computers this time out, but at least I spent some time educating myself on the AMT versus Intel race of things before I wanted to mouth off on computers this time out. But hopefully that'll be interesting. Andre, welcome. Edwin, and all right, I think Xandu Comics. Oh, and Lorna, well to go. And yeah, everyone is just boiling right now in terms of the heat. Even out here in Tennessee, we got a advisory saying just cool it on the air conditioning if you possibly can, because even we're under the grid out here is under pressure apparently. I don't expect there to be big problems, but we have backup generators for a reason, and that's where we're at. Okay, so let's get back to it. By the way, welcome everyone back. We didn't have a show last week, and I don't know if we're having one next week because I got to take a big trip down to Florida. We finally are getting the windows in the place I'm putting down there. When that's all said and done, if I can coordinate about 4 to 5 different people who are doing home improvement type work on the place, I should have a place that's able to survive pretty much anything Mother Nature has to throw at it. It'll drain my bank account pretty good, but if it turns out if you guys ever played like D&D games where there's like mythic armor, and if you collect the whole set, if you get the shield, the helmet, the greaves, and the breastplate, and they're all the matching legendary armor, you get an armor bonus. Well, Florida housing is like that as well. It turns out if you replace all your windows, all your doors, and the garage door, and you make them all impact rated, so in other words, they can survive a 150-mile-an-hour hit from a 2x4 launched by rollers at them, which apparently is the way they test these things down here in hurricane country. If all those things can survive that, then suddenly your homeowner's insurance drops by like a third. So that's why I'll be coordinating next week. So I'm not sure, depending on the timing of a couple things, whether we'll have a live stream next week, but I'm going to try to make it back in time. Anyway, so let's see how we're doing here. Calorie eyes, eye opener. Yeah. So, So let and another thing that's happening next week. I'm sorry, I'm looking at my notes here. Is we'll also be opening up our spots for the kind of like the inner beta, or like the inside track group for Transformer, which is the next major version of ComicBase. That'll be most likely its final production. It'll be just something banal like ComicBase 2023. But when we're in production, when we're not shipping, everything has a code name. ComicBase 2022 was Burning Man. ComicBase 2021 was Crystal Palace, and so forth. But Transformers, the next major version of ComicBase, it has a number of very big changes to the program, and we've finally gotten it stable enough so that we can welcome folks who are interested and don't mind dealing with the nitty-gritty of the sausage making to come on the inside here and essentially join the development team. So we'll invite you to our Slack group. We can give you access to the builds as we build them. You can see all the ones that are not ready for the public to see, and we try them out and pound on them and exchange information about what we like, what's not working, what's working well, and so forth, right up until the point where we're ready to release to the public. But that whole process, I expect to kick off next week, because right as soon as I return from Florida, because we finally gotten it, and you probably saw the effects of this. We were testing updates, which is actually one of the more difficult things we do with the program, which is the whole path between when we enter a piece of information, or one of you guys enter a piece of information, it gets submitted as a correction through editorial process it back into the master. The master pushes out as part of the weekly update. That then gets downloaded into everyone's programs. And if we can finally make that whole very long and complicated path, if the changes all survive that without destroying anything in the process, then we're about ready to, it's safe enough that we can start, showing those bills to the public. Because up until the point where we know that nothing that's going to happen in these test things is ever going to destroy data, we do not risk anyone's data other than ourselves until we know that that's for damn sure set. But one thing we were doing last week is we were testing the update process, just the process of how we push updates to our master server, which then gets downloaded into everyone else's. And that's why, if you guys were paying attention last week, there were actually a couple of test updates because we were getting some of the versioning schemes and things like that for the new version set. It was pretty transparent to 2022. The only thing that you guys saw is that we pushed rather a lot of updates. If you were on the Transformer track, is of the folks inside the company, where you got to see all the weird stuff that we were dealing with. So anyway, that's all ironed out now. So everything's good, and we hope to have that open, and we'll tell you more about that next week. All right, so let me see what else we got going. Oh, by the way, and if you are interested in this sort of stuff, on this channel, we primarily talk about comic-based issues. We'll also talk about comics, comic culture, the occasional movie review and whatnot. But if you're interested in that sort of thing, please hit the like and subscribe button and hit the bell for notifications, because it does help, certainly in the early moments of things. It gets the word around to people on the list, and also lets you know when we have new special events and videos as they come up. So anyway, that's pretty much that's the spiel for today. Let me do a quick check of the chat. My mouth works. It does. All right, let's see here. Greg asks, let's see here. Last time you teased the newspapers would eventually be getting lumped into their own media categories, and a chance that portfolios can get their own category. We're not planning on taking on portfolios at the moment. Let's talk more in the development chat on that one. The one that is really kind of pushed us to accelerate plans that we weren't planning on jumping on for a while, but it's just we got such a massive amount of data submitted this last round out with newspapers that it really became, it was putting pressure on the magazine category. It was really starting to swamp it. And so if people were interested in magazines, but not necessarily newspapers, we wanted to give you a way of tailoring what you got with the program. So it became imperative that we spin newspapers out into their own category. That's something that happens with, you'll see that with Transformer, but we'll talk more about that as things go, and how different media types get handled, but we'll do that one in the next show. The second question was, currently listed some in books, some are listed in comics. If they aren't bound or awkward, to list them with books and comics. I like to say, let's talk on that one a little later. I will say, after a few weeks of just really hard graft, getting everything going, I not really feeling up to the task of taking on new features at the moment. I just want to kind of put a nice paint job on the ones that we managed to squeeze into this one, because man, we did a lot, and that's why we didn't have a show last week, because we were just in the part of maximum chaos during the development part, where if you imagine this is your house and they're remodeling and they're adding a new kitchen, or remodeling a bathroom or something. This is the part where the guys have pulled down all the drywall and the pipes are capped off and no one's allowed into the work area, and there's plastic sheeting everywhere to keep it from polluting the rest of the house. That was the scene of ComicBase Central last week. We finally got things sealed up, and we're just trying to paint things nicely and put some polish on the fixtures at this point. But the actual death of the construction scene is largely fixed up now. So now it's kind of safe to let the pets back into the house, or for that matter, the wife or the residents or whoever else, anyone who's not wearing a hard hat. All right, so let's see here. All right, and let's see. And he says there's already a number of portfolios listed in Davis. Yeah, okay, all right. So we'll hit that as we go. All right, so this week the show is, I basically wanted to take some time and talk about tech challenges. Well, not tech challenges, but more or less tech changes that are happening to kind of both your world and mine. that are going to change up the way that we do a bunch of things around here. And so I kind of want to take this time to kind of survey what are the big things on the horizon that, when you're buying your next computer, or you're trying to figure out, what's the next thing ComicBase is going to land on, or your next network upgrade or whatever else, that maybe ought to enter into your thinking, and just kind of have a look around at what's going on. Now, for the last couple of years, I gotta admit, computers have been dull. They have not done much of anything during the pandemic. Nobody released a new standard that anyone cared about. You couldn't get graphic cards because if they weren't using it to play games while everyone was locked up at home, they were being used to crypto mine. Basically, everyone, whatever rig you had in 2019 is probably the rig, unless your rig just exploded on you, that's pretty much the rig you had in 2022. I mean, there was not a lot new to get excited about it for 3 years, which is an eternity in computers. Before then, there were very major improvements would come along with CPUs about every 2-3 years. Intel was on they call it a tick-tock interval, where they'd basically have a speed ups in one thing and then and a die change on the other, on the other phase of things. But basically every 2.5 years, a new major edition of the Intel architecture would come along. AMD has been a little bit more all over the place on that one. They've had both very, very good times and very, very bad times. But in 2019, they were releasing some chips that were just starting to rip the doors off things. I mean, really stuff to get excited about. In disk storage, you were starting to have the evolution from both SATA hard drives, SATA SSDs to NVMe SSDs. So everyone's computer was starting to get really, really fast in terms of that kind of performance. RAM had solidified around DDR4. It was starting to get pretty good. And then basically nothing happened for 3 years. So we're now at the part where we're kind of at the end of the part shortage, supply shortage of most things. I mean, there's specific things you can't get a hold of for love or money. If you're looking for very high-end graphic cards, good luck to you. If you're looking for network computing type setups with embedded controller boards on them, like very specialized little hardware, the lead times are stupid on those. But for just a regular guy who wants to upgrade his computer, it's been old, you're sick of it, it's running slow, now's actually a good time to get into the mix on things. And also, because of the economic slump that we seem to be entering, a lot of the stuff that was last generation stuff is starting to kind of pile up a little bit in the warehouses, and we're starting to even see some discounting on stuff that beforehand would sell for over market, or over list price. It's starting to actually get discounted again. So that, there's actually, this is not a bad time to start looking around at your options and say, well, what can I do to make my life more comfortable? And honestly, if you're like the rest of us for the last 3 years, we've been spending way too much time doing what we're doing right now, which is sitting in front of a computer. And if you're going to sit in front of a computer, gosh darn it, it should be pleasant to do so. So that, a good thing you can do to make your life more comfortable if you are, in the action-packed life of a computer user like we all are here, is have the most bitchin' computer that makes any kind of sense for your life. Now, look, if all you do on a computer is, email, word processing, and ComicBase, well, then it does not make sense to have a crazy high-spec graphic card and RGB lighting everywhere, unless you just really like that sort of thing. But I mean, there are some things you can do now that you don't necessarily break the bank, and which can make your life as a computer user much more pleasant than it's been. So let's survey the scene and see where we stand. Now, every computer at its heart consists fundamentally of, there's all sorts of ports, there's all sorts of blinky lights and things like that. But at their heart, there's basically 5 things that determine how fast a computer is. There's the CPU, the central processing unit, which is it's a chip. It's usually about this big, sits right in the middle of your computer. It's what does all the work, all the computing on your machine. These days, they're ridiculously complicated compared to what they once were in the old days. But fundamentally, it's a little wafer about 2 inches by 2 inches by 1/4 inch thick, and that's where all the action bottles up in your machine in terms of its computing performance. Now, talking to that is a thing called the graphics processing unit, the GPU, and that is the thing where you're going to spend all the money if you are a gamer. That's the one that handles all the tasks related particularly to rendering 3D graphics. They are crazily powerful computers in their own right. it's not uncommon at this point to have a GPU that costs 2 or 3 times what your CPU costs. So, I mean, the thing that handles your 3D graphics could be 3 times more powerful as a computer than your actual computer is, which is also why GPUs have been impossible to find for the last million years, because they get basically bought up as fast as anyone can make them. They get bought up, used in either supercomputers, where basically it's just a big rack full of GPUs crunching numbers, or they get used in crypto mining rigs, where, especially if you can tap the neighbor's electricity, to run the whole thing, they're used to compute the blockchain transactions, which make crypto go. And so, because they're very, very fast at doing a very, very specific kind of work, they're not general purpose at all. They just do a particular kind of crunching, but they do it along multiple threads. They do it very, very high speed, memory access and so forth. Those are the beasts inside your computer. But also, don't be surprised if you're going to spend $2,000 for your computer, don't be surprised if 1,000 of that was just the GPU. If you're buying a gaming rig, memory, which is that's the RAM. That's where you store all your stuff as you're working. That's one of the areas where I'm going to say the news has been legitimately good of late, where basically as much RAM as it makes any sense to have can be had pretty cheaply. And we'll get into that in a little bit. And then we're going to talk about, after those three, there's disk and there's network. Now, these are not sexy at all. When people talk about computer speeds, you're going to, Costco or Best Buy or whatever else, and you're looking at a box with a computer, people often won't even, I mean, if they list even how big these things are, they certainly won't bother listing how fast these things are. And if you're using something like ComicBase, which is basically a database program, your disk and your network probably make more difference to how fast everything runs than anything else, even the CPU. So I'm going to be encouraging you guys to go, going into some great level of detail about your disk and network stuff, and we'll hit that in a bit. All right, sorry, I see a chat rolling. I just want to do a quick check because every time I see it rolling. All right, we are good. Okay, so all right, so let's go through the current state of those 5 parts: the CPU, GPU, memory, disk, and network. All right, so CPU. Well, let's hit the GPUs first. So, as I said before, GPUs, graphics processing units, it's a card usually about this long. It's, if you open up a larger desktop computer, it's the thing with all the fans on it. That's the one. Which again, up for the last 3 years, as crypto took off, you just couldn't lay your hands on them for love or money. It was the only part I'd ever heard of where, for a computer, where list price would be X, $300, $500, $1,000, and then you'd have to talk about street price that would be 30% over that, or sometimes twice as much. And even then, hard to get. I mean, basically every person in the entire world was buying gray market things off of eBay just to be able to even get their hands on a GPU. That is starting to lay off. It's possible to actually buy mid-spec GPUs these days. By mid-spec, I mean cards that run in the $200 to $400 dollar-ish range. So we're talking about like the 2070 series through the 3050, 3060 series for NVIDIA. Those things, they're starting to come down. They're starting to be available at their list prices, sometimes even a couple bucks below. You can actually get a hold of them over at Newegg. And I'm also going to say, if you've held on to the one you've had this long right now, I'd say in general, hold on a bit longer, unless you are just dying for those extra couple of frames in, playing Elden Ring or Grand Theft Auto or something like that. Right now, the very high end of GPUs is these monster cards like the 3090 Ti, that are sucking down power like you cannot believe. I mean, they'll have like 4 fans mounted on them. Intel has adopted a brand new power standard to supply the juice that these suckers need. I believe, at full pump, these guys will run 450 or better watts, as they're running. So, and for that, it's just a crazy situation. I mean, people are needing special case, brackets to hold them in because it's such a massive card. At the high end, I would say, if you don't know you need it and you haven't already been doing backroom deals to try to get your hands on those ones, hold off, because there's a new generation. The 4000 series is coming from NVIDIA, is coming out pretty quickly, and the current series right now just strikes me as unwieldy behemoths. I would hang fire on those ones. Now, in the mid-range, what I would do mostly if you feel a need to get into that one, look for a mid-spec card, something that'll pep up your performance a little bit. But look for one that's maybe last gen. It's easier to find those. You're going to get a better deal on them. And like I say, some of them, because they're not the preferred thing for crypto mining, are starting to be seen at values that make some kind of sense. Now, the main thing that's going to shape what you need in terms of a GPU is: are you doing anything with 4K, or can you live with 1080p as your monitor standard? If you're running 1080p, honestly, a mid-spec 20 series or 30 series graphic card from NVIDIA is going to do you just fine. You don't need to turn the anti-aliasing and all the settings up to the nth degree. If you don't need ray tracing is a technique in graphics that will basically simulate the path of light as it goes. It basically establishes a model of the entire environment. And so it can, in addition to just running what the artist said to put in there, it can calculate the reflections of different light sources off everything. It's a really sexy, really cool looking trick, especially if you're in an environment like Forza, with all sorts of shiny cars around with lots of reflective metal. It looks super, super pretty as a tech demo. It will beat the living daylights out of your machine and your wallet if you want to get into that stuff in a big way. In general, if you're the kind of person who knows that you need this sort of thing, like just that's whatever hole you've got in your life, if it's filled by having infinite numbers of amounts of shiny reflections off metal in your life, then you already know you're that person, and you've already bought this card. If you're not that person, hang fire on it. It's do yourself a favor and just hold back. Now, for the narrow purpose of watching stuff in ComicBase, a hot graphic card isn't going to do a damn bit of good. ComicBase is a 2D program. If you have a graphic card that was manufactured this century, you're probably going to be just fine. If you had one that's still from the 1990s or something that somehow you're still running in your rig, well, by all means, upgrade that sucker. But honestly, any graphic card after 2010 is probably going to render ComicBase as fast as anything else. So don't worry about it in terms of ComicBase if that's your main thing. And certainly, if your main thing is things like productivity software or even Photoshop or things like that, a fast graphic card just isn't going to do a lot for you, because the 2D performance on graphic cards not very much changed from previous generations. It's all about the really, really fancy 3D stuff. And if that's not your world, if you don't do a lot of really pretty 3D gaming, then don't sweat it. And by not sweating it, by the way, you're also going to have or more the cost of the system you're buying. So that's not a bad thing. All right, now CPUs, right? What should be the most important part of your computer, and even for ComicBase, it is still an important part. There's two main camps. There's AMD. There's Intel. If you're an Apple person, they have their M1 chips, which by all accounts are quite lovely. And now they've just introduced their M2 chip, which again, going mostly by Apple's benchmarks. Apple says Apple's doing great. No one else seems to be able to benchmark them accurately, so I'm going to trust the folk wisdom that says that the M2 chips from Apple are just fine. So anyway, if you're an Apple person, you've got an M2 chip or M1 or M2 chip on your machine, you're running ComicBase using Parallels or something else like that, and you already know it's fast. So don't sweat it. You're done. For all the rest of us on the Windows platform, if you're building a new system where you're choosing and you want to go between AMD and Intel, 2 years ago, I said the advice would have been go AMD. It's a much better price-performance ratio for most people. The only time where Intel was making any sense in terms of price-performance 2 years ago was at the very, very high end. So if you bought the most high-spec Intel core, like the 11900K or something, at that point you could get more performance out of it. You could do things faster than you could with anything that AMD could have thrown into the party. The AMD came along in a big way. They closed that gap for the most part. The top Intel chip, which at this point is the 12900K, is still faster, barely, than the top AMD chip. But the real action for the rest of us is, what does the mid-range chips look like that? And 2 years ago, you were giving up $200-300 for no real reason to go with the Intel way. Intel has changed up their chip pricing. They've introduced some different models down the line, so forth like that. And largely, even in mid-range builds, I'd say it's a coin flip. Go with whatever is most comfortable for you. it's not going to make a lick of difference. And even looking at comparable spec builds, if you're talking about setting up like a 1080p gaming machine or anything like that, um, you're within $50 of the equivalent Intel versus the equivalent Intel versus AMD build. Choose whatever you like. You'll do fine either way. Now, if you need to have the fastest thing on the planet, there's a complicated calculus that comes in as to whether or not you need high performance cores, or if you just need productivity cores. At that point, for productivity, for pure blazing graphics performance, in other words, I want to run Elden Ring at the fastest conceivable frame rate. At that point, the Intel chip barely edges out the fastest AMD chip, but honestly, either one's going to do you just fine. And even if you're buying the top end, of both lines, you're still talking about a $600, $550, $600 chip. For the mid range of each line, you're talking about a $300 chip. Don't get worried. If that's the most expensive part of your computer, you did just fine. So I'm going to say that is one where, again, take one or the other. It's not going to make a great deal of difference in your life. And I'll also go in and say another thing that's not going to make a great deal of difference in your life is component number 3, the RAM. Now, there's two standards of RAM that are having any kind of purchase in the marketplace right now. There's DDR4 and DDR5. DDR5 came along with the very latest version of the Intel chips, the 12 series, in 12th generation. By the way, with Intel chips, if you want to decode what chip is what, and you're looking at the Intel part numbers, you'll see something like 12900K or something like that. That means 12th generation, and then 900 is their top line. There's a 700 to 500 and a 300. So you're talking about like i3 and i5 and i7. But when they look at all that, it's the first two digits of the model number are the generation. So 12 is the current generation of the Intel chips. For AMD, the emerging standards, the Zen 4, the Zen 3 are still out there, the Threadrippers, the 5950s. They're also doing just fine. And both of the latest generations of those will use DDR5 memory if you put it on the motherboard with them. Now, what do I care about DDR4 versus DDR5 memory? Well, it turns out DDR5 memory can work at a higher bandwidth than DDR4 memory. DDR4, the sweet spot of that memory is about 3,000 megahertz. Is it megahertz? Yeah, 300,000 megahertz transfer rate, which is stupid fast. I mean, you're pumping basically 3 gigabits a second worth of memory bandwidth out of the whole thing. You can go faster with DDR5. It'll cost you. Speed does cost. In DDR5, they moved the voltage controller off of the, I believe, the motherboard and onto the DIMM itself. So it makes the, circuitry for the DIMM quite a bit more elaborate, and so it's more costly to manufacture. That said, you can get speeds up to well over 5,000 megahertz on the whole thing, which is saying, oh, hey, my memory is moving almost twice as fast. That's got to help, right? Turns out when you benchmark your whole system, unless you've got some crazy specialized use case, turns out at 3,000 megahertz, which is DDR4 mid-spec kind of RAM, your system's moving about as fast as it's going to move. Your bottlenecks on how fast your system goes are almost always something else. You can get tiny amounts of performance. We're talking like a frame rate or two of a big spec game. If you go full tilt boogie with the DDR5 memory with the 12th generation Intel or the latest generation AMD, you'll double the cost of what you're paying for the memory. But honestly, blind taste test wise, I don't know that anyone would be able to tell. I mean, you literally have to get out specking software and say, oh yeah, it was at 62 frames per second in Elden Ring, and now I'm at 64. If you've got the kind of sensibility that you can tell that, then by all means pay twice as much as you need to for memory. If you're like everyone else, the advice I would give is this: if you're running a DDR5 system, if everything else in your life is DDR5, sure, buy DDR5. But if everything else you're doing is DDR4, run DDR4, put 16 gigs in. That's really the sweet spot. We don't find a lot of advantage to going between 16 and 32 for almost anyone. There are people who will see advantage for going higher than that. I'd say, like, if you do video editing, if you do 3D compositing, if you do, frankly, if you run a database server, which we do, at that point, then it'll take all the memory you could throw at it. But realistically, don't expect to see a lot of performance in 99% of the people out there. Once you've got 16 gigs in your machine, you're just not going to see a lot of it, a lot of bump by going from 16 to 32, and you probably see damn near nothing going from 32 to 64 gigs. Now, I would say think twice before you go down to 8, because between 8 and 16, what happens is your computer runs out of RAM on a modern system. Is it basically takes information that it wanted to put into RAM, and it swaps it off to disk, and then it loads other things and puts them into RAM, and it keeps on shuffling. It uses your disk space as if it was your attic, and there's not enough room in the living room, so you have to keep on shoving things in the attic or the garage, and then, oh wait, somebody else is coming around, I'll need the dinette set from the garage, and so you move it in from the garage, and you put the other the chaise lounges out, you put them, it's like you're moving them out to the garage again. Your computer does that with RAM. So when you're loading huge programs in, if they won't all fit in RAM, it'll take something it wasn't using that frequently, put it out to disk, and repeat the process as needed. Now, remember, Windows itself is going to want to have a gig or two for itself. So that's always your baseline of where you're going on things. So when you think about the other programs you're running in life, so ComicBase is happy to run really in 500-600 megabytes. I mean, it doesn't even need a gigabyte for itself for most people most of the time. If you really go to the nth degree, like you say, I'm going to set the grid so they're showing 100,000 items in the grid, and I'm going to load the biggest graphics I can possibly do. It is possible, if you really work for it, to get it to use all of 2 gigs right now, at which point you might actually hit memory issues. But that's kind of about the size of it. In normal usage, it's 500 megs. Photoshop's going to want a gig or 2, depending on how big your stuff is. If you're running games, that's where you're going to start really, running into large amounts of RAM usage and so forth, particularly if you're running at very high resolutions, or you're running open world games where they have to load big parts of the game into RAM and cycle them out as you're walking around around the grounds and so forth. But anyway, for the most part, though, once you've got 16 gigs in your system, you're just not going to see a lot of action in terms of the swapping of out of RAM and into disk and back and forth. Between 8 and 16, you see a little. Don't go down to 4. Just don't. There's no reason for it on a modern system. I mean, you're talking about $10 worth of RAM at that point. Spend the $10. Save yourself some grief. So if you're looking at a laptop system and there's one with 4 gigs and one's got 8 gigs, for goodness sake, get the 8 gigs, unless you just have a crushing budget, where, it's like you're literally stealing the kids' lunch money in order to buy your computer, in which case, I don't know why you're buying a laptop, but I'd say, get yourself at least 8. 16 is the sweet spot. 32 is if you're feeling exorbitant. 64 if you're a professional mathematician or something. Other than that, just call it a day. There's no need for more than that. And honestly, the good news is 16 gigs of DDR4 RAM will set you back between $50 and $100. It's not a big deal. It's going to come standard on most of your systems. So there's 3 things I've now listed here in this big tech review. I said, basically, don't worry about them. You're probably fine as long as you don't go just crazy. Now let's talk about the things where things get a little bit interesting. And those are the ones that they're the least sexiest of them all. Disk and network. Now, disk, if you've got an old-fashioned disk, I always describe it as being a little bigger than a pack of cards and about half the thickness. That's what a standard SATA disk looks like if you actually crack open your computer and look at it. If it's the spinny magnetic platter that goes around and there's little calipers that read the bits as they go by, and so if your computer makes a sound as you're using it, you have an old-fashioned magnetic disk. If you have one, consider not having one. We've hit the point now, and I've banged on this one a number of times, but old-fashioned magnetic disks are limited by the physics involved of spinning around a big magnetic platter. They're further limited on by what's called the SATA interface. It's the computer connection they plug into. And the reality is, if you've got an old one, it could be running as slow as 20 megabits per second transfer rate. I'm sorry, 20 megabytes per second transfer rate. Which, think about a ComicBase database file. It is about a 1.5 gigabytes in size. So if you had something that was a 10 meg or 100 megabyte transfer rate, it says that it's going to take 150 seconds. I'm sorry, it's going to take 15 seconds to copy that file, best case. If you are running at 20 megabytes per second transfer rate, then it's going to take 5 times longer. I've seen people, when people call in for tech support, who have just fossilized computers. I mean, they've got very old disks. They're very slow performance. One problem is, if it's a laptop in particular, they tend to put very, very slow disks on laptops, both because they were cheaper and also because they're more shock resistant. Laptops get carried around, they get bounced around and so forth. And so the slowest, most awful disks that have ever been created in this century have been put into budget laptops. And if that's what you're using to run ComicBase, deeply encourage you to think about doing something different, because it's just painful. There are things we'll be remoting on with the user and say, okay, let me just close the database here, and it saves a backup. On a modern system, that save a backup part ought to take, I don't know, 10 seconds, if. You shouldn't even notice it. I've had parts where people exit the program, it saves a backup, and it takes 3 minutes, 4 minutes. And that's just crazy. I mean, life is too short, guys. You don't want to spend that kind of time. If you download an update, even if it's a really heavy update, you want it to take 3-4 minutes. You don't want it to take 20 minutes. So everything in your life, when using a database, is going to be disk bound. The speed of the disk is always going to be the gating factor for how fast everything's going, how much you're enjoying your life. Get the fastest disk you can get, and what that means is, have ComicBase not be on a mechanical disk if you can possibly avoid it. If you can't avoid it, put it on the fastest disk in your system. But my number one advice to anyone buying a new machine is get, at minimum, a computer with an SSD. Now, SSDs used to be, SSD stands for solid state disk drive. SSDs kind of come in two flavors. One is like this guy right here. This is a old Samsung 840. This guy is a 1 terabyte guy, and you'll see that it's the same kind of form factor. It's a little bit even smaller than a regular disk drive. A regular disk drive is just a little bit bigger and wider than this guy, and it's about 3 times as thick. But the SSDs are tiny. They're about 2.5 inches wide, and they connect up. If you see the connectors on here, unfortunately, one thing I've learned the hard way here. Let me switch the overhead cam. Let's see if I can make that happen. Is this better or not? Not really. But all right, so these are the SATA connections. That's actually not terrible. So that's the SATA connection. We got power, and when you have the cable right there, it's just 2 little cables inside your computer, and that's how everything hooks in. It's just literally plug, done and done. And these guys are pretty good, but they're going to cap out in terms of speed. What SSDs do is they're solid state memory drives. They're using memory, basically memory that's non-volatile. So in other words, it maintains it maintains the values when the power goes out. So like when you turn off your computer, you lose whatever you were working on, typically, unless it was saved, because your computer's RAM does not save its state. It needs memory to hold. It needs power to hold that. When you're using solid state memory, the second you write it, it stays written until you write something over the top of it. So it doesn't rely on the power staying on, which makes them wonderful for disk drive replacements, because they're crazy fast. There's no mechanical platter to spin, and so they're very fast at getting different places in the disk very quickly. They work brilliantly when there's a bunch of little files, like there is in ComicBase, where it's constantly searching around for lots of little picture files all over the place. And whereas a mechanical hard drive has to spin around, and it does it thousands of times per second, but where it has to spin around and wait till the appropriate part of the disk comes up under that little caliper, these SSDs can just instantly just access it as if it was RAM. It's not quite as fast as RAM, but pretty damn fast. These guys right here, if they hook up over a SATA connection, they cap out around just under 600 megabytes per second read speed. Now remember, if I said, like, if you've got an older mechanical hard drive, it's probably capping out somewhere around 20, 30, sometimes 50 megabytes per second, easily 10 times faster, usually more like 20 or 30 times faster to get one of these guys. These guys, by the way, this is now about 40 bucks. This is a 1 terabyte SSD. You can get them 40, 50 bucks. I mean, this is an older one, so this is even cheaper, but a brand new SATA-based SSD, you can have them as low as 50 bucks. For goodness sake, there's no reason not to get one. If you're waiting on anything with your computer, stop the podcast right now. Go to Best Buy, upgrade your drive, have them move your data over for you. You will thank me. It makes such a difference in booting up your computer, using your computer. Everything about your computer just gets so much faster. Now, if you have a brand new computer, and this is an option for you, this is actually not the end of the road. There's actually, as I mentioned, what's hurting you here is these little SATA connections. It's an older standard, and it caps out. You saturate the SATA bus at way too early in the process. What has come along to replace that is they're called NVMe SSDs. What they are is they look like they almost look like a little stick of RAM, but they mount in a special slot right on newer motherboards. If you have an older motherboard, you don't have the space for it, don't worry about it. But any motherboard that's made in about the last 3-4 years, probably, unless it's incredibly low end, will probably have one or more NVMe, or sometimes they're called M2 SSD spots open for them, where you can get the same type of SSD, like a 1 terabyte Samsung SSD, but not in this form factor. It takes the same chips, it puts them in kind of a long strip, not inside this little square case. You mount it straight onto the motherboard. It accesses your PCI Express bus directly, and as a result, these same chips that were in this guy, they go from a top speed of 560 megabytes per second. Suddenly, they can go up to 3,000 megabytes per second, and that is a beautiful, beautiful thing. That's when you get computers that boot up in like 5 seconds. And that's when you get, again, a couple, 3 seconds to save a backup in ComicBase and things like that. I mean, if you think about it, if this thing can move 3,000 megabytes per second as read speed, it means it will read your entire ComicBase database in half a second. It'll write it usually in about 1 or 2 seconds. So yeah, I mean, it is an absolute game changer, well worth doing. Now, they're slightly more expensive, whereas this guy right here, 1 terabyte SSD in SATA, is going to cost you about 50 bucks, give or take. The equivalent 1 terabyte SSD for M2 is going to cost you something around 100 bucks. You know what? Spend the money. If you got the possibility of having a computer that does that one, again, it'll make a difference in your life like nothing else will, using programs like ComicBase or just using Windows. I would absolutely say that is, for most normal folks, that's where you want to put money before you put it almost anywhere else. The problem on SSDs typically has been there was a much higher cost per megabyte. So, and the other problem is that they cap out pretty early, all things considered. So one scenario that happens for us a lot is we'll have 1 or 2 terabytes on our main disks in the office here, but we'll want to store crazy amounts of files, video files, graphic files, just tons and tons of backup files, wherever those are. That's actually when you do want to buy yourself a very large magnetic hard drive, because when you want to store like 16, 20 terabytes of data in one place, these guys are not economical. Even if you can put them together, it would be stupidly expensive to do that. Whereas for 300 bucks, you can get yourself a 16 terabyte deep storage disk, an enterprise class storage disk to use as for those kind of video files, all that kind of like big backup stuff that you want. That's not a bad way to go. Put your fast stuff, your system, put ComicBase, anything that you want to get to quickly, put that on your SSD. And if you do have those other needs, put that on your magnetic drive if you want to go that way. But if you don't have tons and tons of big things you need to store, there's a lot to be said for just building a computer that consists of nothing but this type of drive. among other things, it's probably going to be dang near silent. There's nothing to listen to. It'll run very, very cool for the most part, because another characteristic of SSDs over hard drives is they tend to be much, they don't heat up as much. And so if you don't have a big fancy graphic card in there, or something that's building up a ton of heat, typically you're going to be able to run the thing without your fan going great guns. And honestly, having a nice quiet working environment is a nice thing. So I would definitely suggest looking into that. All right, so I'm just want to check the chat because I've been talking for a while. I think we're okay. All right, you guys have been listening. Thank you so much. Anyway, so that's kind of my the everything I want to say about SSDs for now, with one exception. Microsoft, I think, has seen that we've hit a particular price break on these ones, where the 1 terabyte SATA is suddenly looking at $40-50 to get this. They now have a proposal circulating amongst their hardware vendors. They're saying, we would like to make it in 2023 that we're not going to certify Windows 11 to run on to be pre-installed on systems that don't have a SSD boot drive. So if I take this one is one of those signs that the end is nigh for the low capacity mechanical drive. So I mean, if you've got stock in Western Digital, and they've done a lot to try to transition themselves to newer technologies, but if you're counting on old school magnetic drives forever, this is a sign that the road's kind of starting to wind up for them, because it's much the same way that, like, when Apple decided one day that they were not going to put optical drives in their computers, it was the end. It was a sign that everyone really had to start getting with the program and finding a way to install software, especially big software like, say, the ComicBase Archive Edition. That's when we had to get very serious about making the whole thing downloadable, even for very big things like the Blu-ray Archive Edition. Because if you don't have a Blu-ray to install onto, you need to have another way of getting the software. But to this day now, looking forward 4 or 5 years, I'm going to say even our Blu-ray editions, we probably ship 4 or 5 to 1 in download form than we do in physical form now, even of the very extreme things. And for things like the Expresses and Pros, it's a handful of those that will ever go in physical format every year. It's the writing is on the wall for the end of that format, I'd say. If you haven't, when Microsoft's talking about saying even in low spec things, we're not going to certify unless you've got an SSD boot drive, it's time to pack it in. All right, last thing, and this is the one that I think is the most interesting, at least for the implications for all of us, and that's your network. Now, most people, their network, if they can stream movies on Netflix, then it's as fast as it needs to be. For us, we do the network very heavy for a number of reasons. One, the aforementioned thing is that all that data that used to be on our Blu-rays and things like that is now usually being downloaded. And so we want our network to be as fast as it can possibly be. Another thing is, because we work in a small office environment here, network speed, if we're constantly transferring gajillions of files over both the interoffice network here, and we're also posting out for all of you folks. So network speed is actually probably, in terms of how happy all you guys are getting with us, is probably has to do more with the speed of our networks and where else than almost anything else. Both the speed of your internet connection and the speed of how fast we can give our data to your internet connection. Now, that one, networks don't evolve nearly as fast as computer tech does, because there's more players involved and everyone has to upgrade at the same time or it doesn't count. But I mean, going over the 20 or 30 years that I've been around, where there were computers around to even talk to, there's only been 4 or 5 different bumps in overall network speed. When I first started over at Apple, we were running at 100 base T. So we got a mighty 10 megabits over the network. It was better than there used to be a network standard that used telephone wire and jacks that would go into the back of your Apple II, and that one I believe ran at something less than, I want to say it was 1 or 1.5 megabits or something like that. But I mean, it was It was better than copying the files onto floppies and trying to install them again, but it wasn't great. Since then, Ethernet came along. The standard cables that we all got in the back of all our machines if we're plugged into any kind of physical hardwired network. For most of us, those have been 100. We retired our 100 base T, our 100 megabit network. That probably got retired probably 10 years ago for most people, and you've probably been running gigabit ever since. God knows I have been in our office. We've probably been running gigabit for the last 15 years. And then it kind of stopped. No one got beyond a gigabit forever. Just number of reasons. One is there was no reason to go above a gigabit for most people. Certainly the internet speeds that we were able to see coming down were nowhere near a gigabit. I mean, we were 10, 15 years ago, I believe we were paying, God, I forget what it was. I want to say it was like $350 a month to get a 1.5 megabit connection to the office, and that's as fast as anyone had back then. The internet speeds have always been the gating factor for how fast anything was moving along. Inside the walls, if you had gigabit, you were as fast as it made any sense to share files with anybody, because when you wanted to go outside the walls, you wanted to email a file, you want to send a file or get a file from a client, it was going at a tenth of whatever speed you were running inside the walls, and so it didn't matter. Now, in recent times, we've seen a lot of things change. So among other things, Wi-Fi came along, and Wi-Fi went from completely awful to not bad at all to, in recent generations, pretty damn fast. As a matter of fact, Wi-Fi, and I'm going to give you both sets of names for these ones, because if you're old school, you remember them with the 802.11g, 802.11n, things like that. That's the name of the network standard that the Wi-Fi was coded for. You might, if you guys are really old school, you might remember Wi-Fi 802.11a and 802.11b. Like, so if you had the original Wi-Fi adapters for your Macs, that's what those guys were running on. If you were working in Wi-Fi in the 90s, you were probably running G. N came along later on, then followed by AC, and AX is the standards as they went. Now, the guys, I don't know, the Wi-Fi consortium decided that this was all ridiculously complicated. You can't sell this to normal consumers. And suddenly, normal consumers were using Wi-Fi for everything because cables were kind of a pain in the butt. That is definitely a trend in recent years, is that we've been getting rid of cables. So in order to sell them to consumers in a little bit more sensible way, they decided, all right, we're just going to rename everything retroactively. So 802.11g became Wi-Fi 3, 802.11n became Wi-Fi 4. The ones you probably, this kind of was proposed in this time frame, so it's probably the first time you've heard it or I have heard it. 802.11ac got renamed as Wi-Fi 5. 802.11ax got renamed as Wi-Fi 6, and now there's a new one coming around called Wi-Fi 6E. Now, what's the difference, right? Now, for practical purposes, since we're talking in the 21st century here, we only need to worry about the last three of these. Any of us who bought a computer in the last 5-10 years is probably running at least 802.11ac. That one had a top speed, in theory, of 1.9 gigabits. So in theory, so if you had two machines that were right next to each other, I mean, perfect, no interference whatsoever, and the world's fastest receivers, they had a theoretical throughput that was almost twice as fast as gigabit Ethernet. Now, what did you see in real life? In real life, you saw 600 megs. You saw, some healthy fraction of gigabit Ethernet. It was never as good as you wanted, and certainly if you're if you're talking to the computer and down in the living room and you're up in your office or something, you never saw anything remotely resembling that. But at least at short distances with clear lines of sight, you could get some pretty good speeds out of that. Now, what's happening out in the world, though, and this is part and parcel with it, is everybody's internet speed. Like, if you lived in a really good urban area, your internet speed went from, again, that 1.5 megabits that we used to have to pay for a DSL line back in San Jose. That got bumped up, I want to say, at about 5 megabits with a really exotic wireless connection to the roof of our building in San Jose at one point. And then eventually, thank God, the day came where they wired the building for cable, at which point we could start putting out like 20 megabits up. One thing about internet at that point is your down speed. So in other words, how fast you could pull down movies from Netflix was typically much faster than your up speed. In other words, how fast you could push content out to email or anywhere else. Now, for us, because we're a computer company and we're putting content out on the web all the time, down speed's nice for us just as people here, but the speed that we care about more than anything is we care about our up speed. We have the opposite problem everybody else does. And for ages, literally, we've made a practice of calling our cable provider about every 6 months and saying, hi, we would like as fast as you could possibly go. Is there anything new that will let you go faster? And for the last 3 years, we've been getting the fastest you can possibly go, which is 40 megabits up, and 300 megabits down. So again, the down, not particularly exciting for you. It means that I could stream 4K movies off Netflix all day long. We could do that to about 5 TVs at once, no problem. But it's not terribly interesting for you guys. The 40 megabits up was kind of interesting because that meant that if you were the only guy hitting our servers at any given point, you could download 40 megabits worth of information for us per second for as big as the download was going to be, which meant, if you're downloading a 80 gigabits, an 8 gigabits ComicBase Blu-ray or a ComicBase archive disk image, something like that, it was going to take you, am I doing the math here right? What was that going to be? 40 down, 8. It's going to take you, a best case, 20 minutes to get that down. And that's if you're the only guy pounding it. Now, if it was a brand new release from us and everyone's pounding it at the same time, then it gets considerably longer, and that's a problem for us. Because literally, as much as we'd love to give you more than that, we just don't have the pipe. Now, there are some folks in different areas where they're lucky enough to have been piped for something faster than cable, and that's fiber. So downtown Nashville, where we very seriously considered buying office space just for this reason, has 1 gigabit fiber, and it's symmetrical fiber, which means it's 1 gigabit up and it's 1 gigabit down. Now, that has been a dream. We've investigated a number of different ways of skinning that particular cat, renting office space in people's closets, whatever we had to do. But I mean, we're sitting there with our 40 gigabyte pipe, which again, we'd have killed for 10 years ago, but now it's the gating factor on how fast we can deliver content to you in a lot of ways. It doesn't come up a lot, but when you're waiting for it, nobody likes waiting. We'd like that wait to be smaller. So we've been lusting after this forever. Well, we got some news a little while ago, and that was that gigabit fiber is coming to our street. And matter of fact, it largely is done with our street. I saw them doing the work up on the poles a couple weeks ago, and as soon as they complete the loop back to Central, then suddenly our servers go from 40 gigabits to 1 gigabit. And so we, in theory, can go, 20, 25 times faster. I'll take it because that is going to be absolutely breathtaking in terms of how fast you'll be able to download things from us. It means that if you've got a strong internet connection and we've got a strong internet connection, downloading an update is going to be a matter of a couple of seconds. Downloading even like the Blu-ray disc images, if you are of a mind to do that, is something you could probably do the whole thing in a couple minutes. We are really, really, really looking forward to that. Now, because the internet speed is in what they're telling us is the end of June they'll be done. Let's call it July, just to be safe, in terms of setting expectations for when that's all going to happen for everybody. But when that happens, you're just going to notice that suddenly the ComicBase servers just got a hell of a lot faster for no reason. You guys will have had to do nothing to make that happen. We'll just be sitting here popping champagne and being over the moon on that one. It also means that we can take a lot of things that we've been forced to host on other people's servers, like the aforementioned ComicBase disk images, so that they didn't flatten our servers, and so you didn't have 20 people trying to download the same image at once. We would actually distribute those amongst servers we'd rent out, for they're called a content delivery network, CDN. We would rent space on several of those, across the country, and you basically, when you went to download something, it would roll a random number between 1 and however many servers we had, and you'd wind up with all the stuff off that server And so that way we didn't immediately, when we put out a new release, flatten our own server with people, overloading it. But even then, you were limited to like a 10 or 20 megabit download because the content delivery network servers, the fastest we could rent, just wouldn't give you that much more speed. You can get more speed, but the amount of money we'd have to spend to do it. Let's just say that if we wanted to keep ComicBase to be anything like an affordable product, we had to pass that by as an option. I think the minimum internet download bills they started with 4 digits in the figures, and they went up from there. But we're talking now about being able to, for very little money, host all our own data ourselves off of very fast servers, which are maintained off of SSDs, pumping the data off of gigabit internet connections to all y'all. And I'm pretty excited about that. Now, there are some changes to ourselves which are going to have to go into a place to make the most of that. And this might be interesting to you guys if gigabit is a factor in your neighborhood as well. Now, I mentioned beforehand that we've been stuck at 1 gigabit for our Ethernet connections, the little blinky lights on the back of everyone's computer that connect to all the other computers over those Ethernet cables. Well, just recently, what had happened is if you were on like a corporate backbone, so like, you're talking about your company's IT department, they probably had a few things in their corporate IT department where even though the one to your desktop was at 1 gigabit, their main computers talking to their main computers might have been over some very expensive and very elaborate connections, which ran at 10 or even 100 base T. Some of those were actually even fiber based. And I've seen, so for instance, if you work at like a video, like a video sharing house or like a video production house, and you need to share like the movie files, that you're using production for with the central storage on your whole thing, they'll actually use fiber optic links to transfer those around, and they will run at 10 or 100 times the speed of a typical, Ethernet. That's very, very specialized hardware. It is crazy expensive. It is not something you or I as consumers would ever consider buying, because take what you spend on your network router, add a couple of digits to it, and then you start being in the right area to talk about making that happen. So to get to like 10 gigabit Ethernet, which you think would be the next step up, or 100 gigabit Ethernet, very, very exotic. Even to this day, it's never really come down in price to the point where any normal person would want to put it in their place unless they're just really showing off. So for instance, an 8-port 10 gigabit router would be well north of $1,000. If you want to go to 100 gigabit, suddenly you're talking much more than that. So that was never really happening. But something that did happen recently, which is pretty interesting, is that they've come up with something they're calling multi-G. What that really is, it's a way of saying not really 10 gigabits per second, but more than 1 gigabit. Typically, 2.5 gigabit is kind of where it all lands, sometimes 5. And if the really good ones will use a 5, and if they can, and they'll try for a 5 connection, they'll step down to a 2.5 gigabit connection, and if they can't do that, they'll step down to 1. But they'll do this on the back of a router that like is within the realm that like a consumer could buy this, and better yet, it'll do it over the cable you've already got. So over your existing Cat 5e cable, the standard Ethernet cable you've got in the back of your machine, if you've got a wired internet connection, they now have the ability, if you just upgrade the router, now you have to upgrade the router both on your computer and wherever it's connecting to. They both have to be running at the same speed to get any benefit out of this. But if for money that's like, it's about 3 times this, the money it would cost for the equivalent just gigabit router. So like if you're trying like an 8-port router, TrendNet sells one that's like $180 to get 8 ports at 2.5 gigabits each. You can give yourself a pretty healthy bump in terms of how fast your wired internet is running. And we have recently done that inside the walls here at ComicBase. So if you notice a little bit less network latency, recently, that would be what's happening with that, because all the important servers and all the important central computers here are all talking to each other, a little about 2.5 times faster than they were, last week. That's something that we made happen. And the thing that's also nice about that is even though 2.5G connectors are something you're starting to see on 12th generation Intel motherboards and the latest AMD motherboards. You don't see them on older ones. Even if you've got an older computer, though, you can get, it's like a $30 adapter or $22 adapter from Pluggable or a number of other people. If anyone's interested, I can send you some links of what we wound up using. But you can literally plug it into a USB 3 port, and it'll give you a 2.5G network connector, which you can use to bump the speed of your current device and allow it to talk to other devices on your own network 2.5 times faster, which, if you're in this business, is worth doing, because we regularly are transferring terabytes of data across our network. And if we can do it in, a few hours instead of a few days, that's a good thing for us. So I think the thing that's driving all that is it's a combination of it's now possible to get those lucky people who are in Nashville or things like that. You can now get plans for your internet that now actually go faster than a gigabit. I've seen advertised speeds on internet to the home. I've seen them as high as 3 gigabits. Unfortunately, not near any home that in a state where I live, but I've seen that exist in the world. 2 gigabit internet is a real thing, and get ready for that to be put basically over the same lines we've got now. So once you're on fiber, ramping up the middle components to make that happen, that's less of a problem. The problem from getting between, kind of like the cable runs of internet and the fiber thing is you're digging trenches, you're running new lines. It's a massive, massive construction cost, which is why it took many, many years to make that happen. But once you're at fiber, getting the individual components, the different switchers and routers and things like that up to speed, that's much less of a burden for the telecoms to make happen. And so I think you're going to see that really explode in the next couple of years, is seeing gig and multi-gig Ethernet internet become available pretty much to a lot of places. But to really take advantage of that, you've actually got to bump up your own home network, so you can't rely on the same 1 gigabit switches anymore, because suddenly your switch, the thing that was faster than anything for ages, is now the gating factor in your own network. So do have a look at some of those multiple gigabit technologies. And then last, I'd say also look at Wi-Fi 6 and 6E. So Wi-Fi 5, remember, had a theoretical maximum of 1.9 gigabits, really kind of capped down around 500 or 600 megabits. Wi-Fi 6 and Wi-Fi 6E. Wi-Fi 6 caps out at 2.4 gigabits per second, but Wi-Fi 6E uses a brand new, and apologize if this is confusing, but with Wi-Fi, you're using spectrum, just like radio. You're using parts of the electromagnetic spectrum to transfer data. They basically allocated a big chunk at the 6 gigahertz band, which isn't a band that's used by every other device in your house. So everything right now, from your garage door to your cellular phone to whatever else, is running on some of these lower bands, the 2.4 gigahertz band, the 4 gigahertz band sometimes. But those signals, if you could see the radio waves buzzing around your house right now, you would see that the different levels, of spectrum in your house are getting very, very cluttered with different devices' signals right now. There's a brand new bunch over here at 6 gigahertz that's wide open. Nobody's using it, and a big chunk of it is now dedicated for this new Wi-Fi 6E standard. So they think that by teaming up a bunch of different receivers, a bunch of different antennas on both the sender and the receiver, they think that they can get speeds up to 9.6 gigahertz over the air in the ideal environment. Now, what does that mean really? It means you probably get 4 or 5 gigahertz, but it means that your Wi-Fi can be faster than the cabled connection you've got now. Now, will it require a brand new router? Yeah. Will that router cost you about $600? Yeah. Will it require all new network cards and all new devices on all your laptops and everything else? Yeah. You won't see that speed unless you upgrade all that stuff. But if you do, this is crazy, is you could get faster speeds over the air, no cables involved whatsoever, than anyone's seeing today. And you could really, really make the most out of these crazy, blazing fast new internet speeds that we're starting to see people offer. So anyway, that's kind of the long, long overview of what's going up on things. So a little kind of a short breakdown of what we're doing here, and then I'm going to sign out because I got to get to a concert tonight. I'm going to see the Dead Kennedys. Les Jello Biafra, of all things. I've only found out now that that the lead singer, the very, very snarky punk legend, is no longer with the band. So I'm like, I'm not even sure why I'm going to the show anymore, other than to pick up the T-shirt and hear Holiday in Cambodia. But anyway, I'm off to that tonight. But what we're doing here is in the next month, call it a month out before we worry about it, you should see the ComicBase network speeds get dramatically faster. So everything that you do that involves downloading or sending us data should just get much, much, much faster than it's been before. We also can bring in a lot of content that we'd had, been paying outside vendors for. We can bring that in-house, makes it easier to control, makes it easier to update. Frankly, brings our costs down, which, that's good because it keeps us from having to raise the rates on you guys. It's nice when there's one thing on this planet that isn't going through the roof in terms of price. So that is something that we're looking forward to. So that should be happening sometime in the next month. We already had to upgrade our own firewall and a lot of our internal networking to get ready for it. As a result, some of the things that we do, so you see things like saving backups or transferring data, is already faster than it's been. But the real bump's going to be for you guys when that goes live for us at that point. As far as what am I going to do with my next computer, if I were building a machine today. If I had $1,500 to throw at a new computer, I would probably be buying a 12th generation Intel or a 5950 AMD, between 16 and 32 gigs of RAM, a 30 series mid-range GPU. It's like a 3050, 3060. Honestly, I'm not that. I like 3D games, but I don't have that lavish of a setup. I'm not the guy trying to get the best frame rate out of Elden Ring. That's not me. I'm happy when the darn thing runs. I'll be sticking either one or two M2 SSDs into the whole thing because I always like storage space and I never have enough of it. And probably a 16 terabyte mechanical hard drive for deep storage. And I'd be running 2.5 gigahertz wired Ethernet off the back, interfacing to a 6E wireless if I wanted to run things wireless. And the cool thing is the entire thing should only set me back about $1,300, $1,300 to $1,500. That is beautiful. So anyway, that's kind of where I'm at on things. There's the long, deep dive into computer specs for the day. I hope this was interesting to someone. And I'm going to have to bail out of here. Thank you, everyone, for watching, and I will catch all of you next time. Take care, and I will try to let you guys know if I have to skip next week's broadcast. Wish me luck on the home improvement stuff down in Florida. And if we can get wrapped up early, I'll be back. If not, then I'll see you in 2 weeks. You guys take care, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.